podcast. My name is J.C. Harris, and I am your host for today. Friends, we talk a lot about the importance of having a local strategy because, functionally speaking, the law is so stacked against us at the federal level. People constantly beat up on the FAA, but ultimately this comes down to Congress. We say it over and over again. It has been the express will of Congress to promote aviation and repeatedly to correct what they perceive as the overreach of earlier environmental laws. So we wanted to break down the framework that we all have to live with. And like everything else to do with airports, it's not exactly what you probably think. Now, obviously, there were environmental rules and regulations before 1970, but they were kind of ad hoc. Several states had very aggressive programs, including Washington, but each kind of had their own, focus. For example, Hawaii focused a lot and continues to do so on wood-burning stoves. And, of course, we had factories like ASARCO, the smelters around Tacoma. California developed a huge community advocacy on auto emissions. I mean, if you think about environmentalism from the 1960s, you probably have this image of smog in LA. That was local community advocacy that built that up. And then you get to the National Environment Policy Act, NEPA, 1970, and the creation of the EPA, spearheaded by our own Washingtonian Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. They're giving some, no doubt, sage advice to our other Senator, Warren G. Magnuson. That's where the confusion starts, because the framework really centered on the office of the president through something called the Council on Environmental Quality, the CEQ, not the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA that everybody knows about, and definitely not the FAA. CEQ is a council of experts that sets the broad policy goals for the nation and again reports to the president. The EPA tends to be about monitoring and developing regulations, the administrative state for all that stuff. But the overall goals and policy direction emanates from the CEQ. Government department like Defense and Transportation implement their own set of rules. These follow federal law, but again, have to also follow the directives set by the president. Still with me? By the way, have you noticed that arguably the two most environmentally consequential presidents in American history were both Republicans? Teddy Roosevelt, national parks, a billion years ago, and Richard Nixon, who established all of this stuff, including NEPA and the Environmental Protection Agency. And the first administrator of the EPA, also a Republican, the person who most set the tone for what it was supposed to be, a Washingtonian, William Ruckelshaus. We'd say that not because there are any politics, but there have been people of conscience on environmental issues all across the political spectrum, or at least there used to be. And also, to point out, again, counterintuitively, that was kind of the high watermark for airport communities. There has been no president since then who has improved our lot. It's been pretty much all downhill since. Anywho, because it is a big country, CEQ and NEPA kind of outsourced the regulatory and monitoring to the states and to these regional sub-agencies called SIPs, State Implementation Plans. Who comes up with these acronyms, right? And those SIPs, those regional arms, include PSCA, the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency. Puget Sound Clean Air Agency essentially came into being before NEPA. Like I said, we did have these state programs. It sort of reports to both the State Department of Ecology and to the EPA. They, PSCA, monitor and enforce air quality for a 4-county region. Now, why 4 counties when King County alone is already so ginormous? Well, blame the mountain. The 7 big SIPs in WA are organized according to airshed, and our 4 counties share that airshed. That also kind of screws airport communities around here, because even though our airport is the biggest polluter in King County, greenhouse gases and so forth, since we're part of that 4-county group, their wider interests, wildfires and climate change writ large, always kind of leave us with pretty much no seat at the table. For example, they have a 26-member advisory committee, and there's literally no member dedicated to the airport. By the way, I sometimes get the frowny face saying PSCA, and I'm like, look, that's what everybody calls it, because the 7 SIPs kind of have these similar acronyms: PSCA, NORCA, BRCA, YITCA. Anyway, in theory, agencies like PSCA have a tremendous authority. They can shut down a factory and big polluters for violations of federal and state law, but they're following that template laid down by the federal government. That template defines what they're allowed to regulate, specific criteria, pollutants, and it's kind of a floor, but it's also a ceiling. They can enforce what's between the floor and the ceiling, but they can't go beyond it, with one notable exception. Now, in 1970, this was a massive change to the administrative state. It was a whole set of rules for every agency in the federal government. And it was implied that there would be changes, revisions, as science improved and new pollutants were discovered. But politics is always a two-way swinging door. The law also allowed Congress to clamp down on that ceiling and reduce regulatory requirements and authority. And almost immediately, the lobbying began, and that is what happened, especially regarding airport communities, both the noise and the pollution. One of the most consequential changes for us, initially noise regulations for aircraft were under EPA, as most people expect, just like any other public health issue. It's just common sense. But as the 70s went on, industry lobbied hard for deregulation and all kinds of carve-outs, and noise got moved out of EPA authority and into the FAA. We've talked about that in our episodes on Part 150. But there's a much larger version of this story, and it has to do with the one big exception I mentioned a few minutes ago, tailpipe emissions. And for that, every day, if you like clean air, and if you're listening, we assume you enjoy clean air. Thank God for California every morning, regardless of your feelings about
the Californians.
Remember that floor and ceiling? There was a carve-out in the original federal law for tailpipe emissions. It allowed individual states to punch through, to raise that ceiling, to set their own higher regulatory standards. And that came down to the same strong local advocacy in California around smog in the LA area. It was grassroots actions in the 60s. There's a great documentary, and we'll have a link in the show notes. California was able to set higher emission standards for autos sold in that great state. And because California is such a massive market by many metrics, it would be one of the 10 largest economies on the planet, and because manufacturers did not want to build multiple versions of every one of their vehicles, one for California and one for other states and so on, they decided to standardize around California's higher environmental standards. Note that it was more profitable to simply re-engineer a little bit. The fact that California was allowed to set its own standard, and because they drive so much of the market, no pun intended, that is what created the huge improvements in auto emissions and mileage standards that we all appreciate today. Even the push towards EVs, basically every improvement in automobile efficiency and environmental standards traces back to California and that original carve-out in the Clean Air Act. And these do not make things more expensive. They save you money, especially when gas hits $5 a gallon, like now. It's been a myth that these things have made automobiles more expensive. Now, what does that have to do with aviation? Congress allowed that carve-out for automobiles. But as I said, the aviation industry pushed really hard to make sure that a similar mechanism would not be available for aircraft manufacturer. Not emissions, not noise. So there is no way for any state to set a higher standard on aviation noise or emissions than that federal ceiling. That's not a regulation subject to interpretation or an administrator's whim, or even a court decision. That's in the law. Now, you might wonder, why was California, able to drive auto emissions? I keep going with these puns. And not, say, Michigan. Well, of course, Detroit was the auto industry, is the auto industry sort of still. That's the thing about factory towns. An industry town gets co-opted. We don't want to go too hard on Detroit because the most consequential congressman on environmental issues of the last 50 years was John Dingell. He found a way to thread the needle and push for clean air, clean water, higher mileage standards, and pollution, and be a friend to labor. Congressman Dingell was the furthest thing from a lefty squish. His story is to say the least interesting. But I want to give credit where credit is due, because California or no, you still need somebody in the manufacturer's state to act courageously, and on environmental issues, Dingell delivered. Engineers and manufacturers step up every time. California proved that. And every time anyone has leaned on Detroit, they have risen to the challenge. Now, keep that in mind, because it explains a lot about what has happened here at Sea-Tac Airport. In terms of American aviation, Boeing has become something of a monopoly or a monopsony. Go look that up. And they have been for decades. There's literally one major commercial manufacturer left in the United States. In automotive, you've at least got 2.5 big ones left and a dozen small ones. In aviation, there's Boeing. And a huge part of Boeing's manufacturing and design is still done right here in Puget Sound. Now, Seattle likes to think of itself as progressive and so on, but, essentially, historically, it's been a factory town. And the factory, for many generations, was Boeing. In a different world, a carve-out that enabled California to push for higher automotive standards could have been applied to Washington for aviation, just in a slightly different way. In that case, You could have a state law that required aircraft manufactured in our great state to have lower noise and fewer emissions. And that would benefit everyone in America, nay, the world, because Boeing drives the market. Obviously, that did not happen. Over the decades, Washington has made sure its federal electeds are always at the top of the food chain in transportation. Rick Larsen has been ranking member of the Aviation Subcommittee in the House for years. Senator Maria Cantwell as well in the Senate. Patty Murray has been chair of Appropriations. As we've seen, we had the most influential senator, arguably, in American history when it comes to environmental law in Scoop Jackson. To their credit, they pushed for some things like financing for property buyouts and the noise lands that made Sea-Tac Park, North Sea-Tac Park now, possible. But it is striking that the state of WA, which by far had the most leverage to incentivize the industry to do more, including building better aircraft, chose not to do so. You can find any number of examples of environmentally minded electeds like Edmund Muskie from that same era from Maine, not too much industry there. But this points out an essential tension in passing NEPA. Senator Jackson favored a strongly centralized approach, making sure that there would be an adequate floor. Senator Edmund Muskie argued strenuously for a decentralized approach. He said that states like California and like WA that were doing great work and really knew the specific needs of their states should be allowed tremendous flexibility in having higher ceilings. Senator Jackson won the day. There was a lot more concern or a sense that the federal government would do a better job, and overall that higher floor would be the way to go rather than having 50 separate standards. It's a rare federal elected who behaves like John Dingell and finds a way to improve the industry, to work on the abatement, making the products better, quieter, less emissions, which intrinsically benefits everyone. We have been at the top of the food chain in terms of power, but not in terms of that kind of courage. Boeing's most popular aircraft system is over 40 years old. They haven't developed a new system in over a decade, and they have no plans to do so in the next. It is the lack of any competitive or regulatory pressure that prevents the industry from making improvements that would help our communities. Today, federal electeds continue to promote the tired greenwashing of sustainable aviation fuel. The number of gallons ever pumped at Sea-Tac is about, 0. And every promise from airlines to even get to 10% have gone by the wayside. Electrification, which is still many decades in the future, second airports that will never happen. It's fair to say that when it comes to commercial aviation, less real progress on reducing community impacts has been made than in any other form of transportation. We've asked almost nothing of the industry in decades, and that largely comes down to a monopoly. The industry lobbied to make sure that no state could create a similar carve-out. It's a real fail for everybody. The main reason few state legislators, people who actually care about these issues, struggle so much and frankly so often keep trying things that have not worked before and are not great ideas now is more desperation than anything else. The more obvious tools, the pathways you would expect, they don't exist, desperate times and so on. And it's the reason we fight locally. Many people continue to fight or want us to fight based on how the world should work at that federal level. We know how the world should work. We just told you how it should work. It doesn't. So when people ask us, why do you spend so much time on local solutions? Why are you taking this to city by city? That's why. Because that is where the tools are, at the local level. We can prove it to you over and over again. The city of Des Moines is working on an air quality monitor to help establish the first network of its kind anywhere. It's something researchers have needed since forever. It's been in all kinds of legislative proposals at the federal level for years. And, you can keep, talking about how great it would be to have a law like that, or you can simply DIY it, which we could also do with 20 other things. But for today, we just wanted to explain the CEQ and the overall federal framework. EPA, NEPA, the SIPs, PSCA, the regional arms, and so forth. And again, to point out that, things have been pretty much downhill since Nixon. If that's ironic or not, over time, Congress, including our very powerful legislative caucus, also did their part to reduce our leverage. You'll also hear about Supreme Court cases, and almost none of them have gone our way for over a decade. So people like to blame the FAA. Could they do more? Occasionally, yes. But at the end of the day, again, for the most part, they're simply enforcing laws made by others which we find unjust. Sometimes we catch them doing the wrong things. We should. And when we do, we should make them pay. But at the end of the day, that does not change their mission. They are enforcing the overall will of Congress. We're not telling you that to say that
resistance is futile.
We're telling you that to get you to understand why our strategy and tactics make the most sense. We can make progress. Today, we're going to have another explainer on the dramatic improvements to air that directly stem from the LA Community Group's advocacy. But for now, if you love clean air, honk for California. The people with the foresight who left that carve-out in the original code and kept fighting to keep it there. We cannot imagine what the state of the environment would be without the improvements they drove for all of us. Just by taking action locally and then working hard to keep the federal government from taking it away.